close your eyes and imagine something for me. Imagine you're standing in the middle of a vast green valley in what will one day be called Ohio. The year is around 200 AD, give or take a few decades, and the world around you looks nothing like what you might expect. There are no cities in the modern sense, no stone temples reaching toward the sky, no paved roads cutting through the forest. But what you see instead is something that might take your breath away even more than any of those things. Stretching out before you, carved into the living earth itself, are geometric shapes so precise and so enormous that you cannot see their full extent from the ground. Perfect circles hundreds of feet across, perfect squares aligned to the compass points, perfect octagons with walls of earth standing taller than your head, and connecting these shapes to one another, running across the landscape like the veins of some enormous living organism, are long parallel walls of earth that stretch for miles in perfectly straight lines, linking one set of earthworks to the next, linking one ceremonial centre to another, linking communities that are separated by distances that would take you days to walk. The earth beneath your feet is soft and cool, a rich dark soil that has been built up over millennia by the flooding of the rivers that weave through this valley. The air smells of wet grass and fallen leaves and wood smoke drifting from a settlement somewhere beyond the tree line. Birds are singing, dozens of species filling the early morning air with a chorus so rich and layered that it sounds like music composed by the forest itself. A red-tailed hawk circles overhead, riding the thermal currents that rise from the warming earth, its shadow passing over the geometric shapes below like the hand of a clock sweeping across a face too large for human comprehension. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker drums against a dead tree, the sound sharp and rhythmic like a heartbeat, and as you stand here, turning slowly to take in the full scope of what surrounds you, you begin to realize that these earthworks are not random shapes scattered across the landscape. They are connected. They are organized. They are part of a single vast design that stretches beyond the limits of your vision, a design that someone or many someones conceived in their minds and then brought into physical existence through years of patient, back-breaking labour. The precision is what strikes you first. These are not rough mounds of heaped-up dirt. The circles are truly circular. The squares are truly square. The walls are uniform in height and width, their surfaces smooth and carefully maintained. The parallel corridors that connect one enclosure to another run straight as arrows for distances that seem impossible to achieve without modern surveying equipment. And yet there is no modern equipment here. There are no transits or laser levels or GPS units. There are only people, and their knowledge, and their hands, and the simple tools they have fashioned from wood and stone and bone. People who understood geometry well enough to lay out a perfect circle 900 feet in diameter. People who understood astronomy well enough to align their walls to the rising and setting positions of the moon at the extreme points of its 18.5-year cycle. How did they do it? How did they lay out a perfect circle 900 feet in diameter using technology available 2,000 years ago? The answer, as best as archaeologists can reconstruct it, involved a combination of simple but ingenious techniques. A perfect circle can be laid out using nothing more than a central stake and a long cord. Drive the stake into the ground, tie one end of a cord to it, stretch the cord to the desired radius, and walk around the stake while keeping the cord taut, marking the ground as you go. The result is a perfect circle, regardless of its size. The same basic principle can be extended to create other geometric forms. A square can be constructed by establishing a baseline, erecting perpendiculars at each end using the 3-4-5 triangle method and connecting the resulting points. An octagon can be constructed by bisecting the angles of a square. These are not advanced mathematical concepts. They are practical applications of geometry that can be discovered independently by any culture that pays close attention to the properties of shapes and the relationships between them. But the Hopewell did not just lay out shapes on flat ground. They built these shapes in 3 dimensions, creating walls of earth that rose to heights of 10 or 15 feet and maintained consistent profiles over distances of hundreds or even thousands of feet. This required a different kind of knowledge, a knowledge of soil mechanics, of how different types of earth behave when stacked and compacted, of how to build walls that will resist erosion and maintain their shape over time. The Hopewell builders selected their soils carefully, using different types of earth for different purposes. The cores of the walls often consist of dense clay that provides structural strength, while the outer surfaces are faced with lighter, sandier soil that resists water erosion. In some cases, the walls show evidence of deliberate layering, with thin strata of different soil types, alternating in patterns that suggest a sophisticated understanding of how to build earthen structures that will endure, and endure they have. After 2,000 years of rain and frost and root growth and animal burrowing, and in more recent centuries the depredations of ploughing and development, many of the Hopewell earthworks still stand. Their profiles are softer now, rounded by centuries of erosion, their walls lower than they once were, but the basic shapes are still recognizable, still precise enough that modern surveyors can measure their alignments and confirm their geometric accuracy. 2,000 years of weathering has not been enough to erase what the Hopewell built. That is a testament not just to the scale of the construction, but to the quality of the engineering that went into it. People who understood engineering well enough to move millions of cubic feet of earth and shape it into forms that have endured for 2,000 years. You're standing inside what archaeologists today call the Hopewell Interaction Sphere, and it represents one of the most remarkable and least understood chapters in the entire history of North America. For more than 1,000 years, from roughly 200 BC to around 500 AD, with roots reaching back even further and echoes that lasted for centuries after, the cultures that built these earthworks maintained a network of exchange and shared belief that connected people from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic coast, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, a network so vast, so sophisticated, and so enduring that calling it anything less than an empire of ideas seems like an understatement. And yet most people have never heard of it. Most people, if they think about ancient North America at all, picture small bands of nomadic hunters wandering through an empty wilderness, waiting for Europeans to arrive and bring civilization with them. That image is not just incomplete, it is profoundly, almost laughably wrong. The people who built the earthworks you're standing among right now were not simple or primitive. They were astronomers who tracked the movements of the moon across an 18-and-a-half-year cycle with a precision that modern scientists did not fully appreciate until the 20th century. They were engineers who moved millions of cubic feet of earth, using nothing but baskets and human hands, shaping the landscape into forms that encoded complex mathematical relationships. They were artists who created objects of such beauty and sophistication that when archaeologists first unearthed them in the 19th century, many refused to believe that indigenous Americans could have made them. They were traders who maintained relationships spanning thousands of miles, exchanging materials that had no practical value whatsoever, but carried enormous symbolic and spiritual meaning. And they were thinkers, philosophers if you will, who developed a shared symbolic language, a common visual vocabulary of shapes and images and ideas that spread across half a continent without any central authority enforcing it, without any army conquering new territory, without any written language recording its tenets. It spread because it was powerful. It spread because it was beautiful. It spread because it answered questions that every human being has asked since the beginning of consciousness itself. Questions about life and death, about transformation and renewal, about the relationship between the earth and the sky and the water, and the beings that move between all of these realms. So tonight, as you settle into whatever comfortable position you have found, as your breathing begins to slow and the sounds of your modern world begin to fade, let me take you back to that valley in Ohio. Let me walk you through 1,000 years of history that most of the world has forgotten. Let me show you the forgotten empire that ruled America, not through force or fear, but through the irresistible power of shared meaning. And I promise you that by the time we are done, you will never look at this continent the same way again. But to understand the Hopewell, we need to start before the Hopewell. We need to go back to the very beginning of mound building in North America, because the tradition that the Hopewell inherited and transformed into something extraordinary did not spring from nothing. It had roots that reach back thousands of years before the first Hopewell earthwork was ever constructed. The oldest known mound complex in North America is a place called Watson Brake, and it sits in northeastern Louisiana. When archaeologists finally dated it properly in the late 1990s, the results stunned the academic world. Watson Brake was built around 3500 BC. Let that number settle in your mind for a moment. 3500 BC. That means Watson Brake is older than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It is older than Stonehenge. It is older than the earliest cities of Mesopotamia. It is one of the oldest monumental constructions anywhere on Earth, and it was built by people who were not farmers, not city dwellers, not members of any kind of hierarchical state society. They were hunter-gatherers, people who lived by fishing in the rivers and bayous of Louisiana, by gathering nuts and seeds from the forests, by hunting deer and small game through the bottomland hardwoods. And yet these supposedly simple people decided, for reasons we can only guess at, to construct 11 mounds connected by ridges into an oval formation roughly 900 feet across. The largest mound rises about 25 feet above the surrounding floodplain. They carried every single basket of earth by hand. They had no draft animals, no wheels, no metal tools. Just human muscles and human determination and whatever vision was driving them to reshape the earth itself into a form that mattered to them. And here is what is truly remarkable about Watson Brake. It was not a one-time project. The mounds were built up gradually over a period of several hundred years. Generation after generation returned to this same spot, added more earth to the existing mounds, maintained the shape, preserved the vision. Whatever meaning Watson Brake held for its builders, that meaning was powerful enough to sustain a construction project lasting centuries. Think about that. Think about how many human lifetimes that represents. Think about how many grandmothers told their grandchildren about this place, how many fathers brought their sons here for the first time, how many communities gathered on this spot and decided together that the work should continue. Watson Brake tells us something fundamental about the people of ancient North America. It tells us that the impulse to build, to shape the earth, to create monumental landscapes that encode meaning and memory, is not something that arrived here from somewhere else. It is not something that required agriculture or cities or kings. It is something that grew organically from the lives and beliefs of the people who had been living on this continent for thousands of years already. And Watson Brake was just the beginning. Let me take you there for a moment to Watson Brake as it might have existed around 3400 BC. You're walking along the edge of the Ouachita River floodplain in late spring, and the air is thick with humidity and the smell of river mud and blooming magnolia. The cypress trees along the riverbank are draped in Spanish moss that hangs like curtains of pale green lace. The water is high from the spring rains, and the floodplain is dotted with shallow pools that catch the sunlight and reflect the sky like scattered mirrors. Fish are everywhere, bass and catfish and gar, their scales flashing in the shallows as they move through the warm water. Turtles sun themselves on half-submerged logs. Herons stand motionless in the shallows, their long necks coiled like springs ready to strike. You have been walking for most of the morning, following a trail through the bottomland hardwoods, and now the trees begin to open up ahead of you, and you can see it. The mound complex rising above the floodplain like a crown of earth. The mounds are not enormous by the standards of what will come later, but they are unmistakable, deliberate shapes rising above the flat landscape in an arrangement that is clearly not natural. The largest mound dominates the northern edge of the complex, a broad conical shape with a flattened top where you can see figures moving, people tending a fire, its smoke rising straight up in the still morning air. The connecting ridges between the mounds create a kind of enclosed space, an interior that feels separate from the surrounding landscape, set apart, sacred. There are people here, several dozen of them, perhaps more arriving throughout the day. They have come from camps scattered along the river system, and they are bringing things with them. Baskets of freshly caught fish, bundles of dried meat, bags of hickory nuts and pecans gathered from the managed groves around the complex. But they are also bringing earth. Basket after basket of carefully selected soil, carried on their backs or balanced on their heads, each load destined for a specific spot on one of the mounds. A woman near the base of the largest mound directs the work, pointing to where each load should be deposited, tamped down, compacted with wooden tools that have been shaped and smoothed by years of use. She does this with the quiet authority of someone who has done it many times before, who learned the process from her mother, who learned it from her mother before that. The work is not hurried. It does not need to be. The mound has been growing for generations, and it will continue growing for generations more. Each layer of earth is a layer of time, a record of every gathering, every season, every community that has contributed to this place. The earth remembers every hand that shaped it. And this is the pattern that will repeat across eastern North America for the next 5,000 years. The pattern of communities gathering at sacred places to add earth to growing mounds, to conduct ceremonies, to exchange materials and stories and ideas, to renew the bonds that hold them together across distance and time. About 1,000 years after Watson Brake, around 1700 BC, another monumental complex began to take shape in Louisiana. This one was bigger, much bigger, much. It is called Poverty Point, and it remains one of the most impressive archaeological sites in all of North America. Poverty Point consists of a series of massive concentric half-rings of Earth, 6 of them nested inside one another, with the outermost ring measuring about 3/4 of a mile across. At the western edge of the complex stands the enormous bird-shaped mound, Mound A, that rises 72 feet above the surrounding plain and contains roughly 238,000 cubic meters of earth. To put that in perspective, Mound A at Poverty Point is one of the largest earthen structures ever built in North America, and it was constructed in a remarkably short period of time. Think about what that looks like in practice. Imagine a warm morning in late summer, the air already heavy with humidity, and you're standing at the edge of a vast construction site. Hundreds of people are spread across the landscape, working in teams. Some are digging soil from borrow pits near the bayou, their wooden digging sticks breaking through the clay, their hands scooping the loose earth into baskets woven from river cane. Others are carrying those baskets balanced on their heads or strapped to their backs with cordage made from plant fibers, walking in long lines from the borrow pits to the growing mound, their feet wearing smooth paths into the ground. At the mound itself, other workers are receiving the baskets, dumping the earth onto the growing surface, spreading it evenly, tamping it down with wooden tools. The mound is already taller than any person, it is already wider than any house, and it is growing visibly, hour by hour, as the steady stream of baskets deposits their loads on its surface. Someone is directing all of this. Someone, or more likely a group of someones, has designed the shape of the mound, calculated the volume of earth required, organized the labor force into teams, planned the sequence of construction so that each section is completed in the right order, and coordinated the logistics of feeding and housing hundreds of workers for the duration of the project. This is project management on a scale that would challenge a modern construction firm, and it is being accomplished without written plans, without power tools, without machinery of any kind. Just human intelligence and human cooperation and human muscle, sustained day after day for months on end. The sound of the construction fills the air, a rhythmic cadence of digging and carrying and dumping that becomes almost meditative after a while, a heartbeat of labor that syncs with your own pulse until you cannot tell where your body ends and the work begins. And above it all, the great bird is taking shape, its wings spreading wider with each passing day, its tail growing longer, its body rising higher, until finally it stands complete against the sky. A monument to the collective will of a people who decided that this piece of earth should be shaped into something meaningful, something lasting, something that would still be here 3,700 years later, when archaeologists would stand on its surface and marvel at what human beings can accomplish when they work together. Some estimates suggest it may have been built in as little as 90 days, which would have required an extraordinary mobilization of labor, hundreds, or perhaps thousands of people working together in a coordinated effort that implies a level of social organization far beyond what most people imagine for ancient hunter-gatherer societies. And Poverty Point was connected to the wider world in ways that seem almost impossible for its time period. Archaeologists have found materials at Poverty Point that came from sources hundreds and even thousands of miles away. Copper from the Great Lakes region, galena, a lead ore from Missouri, soapstone from the Appalachian Mountains, various types of chert and flint from sources scattered across the Midwest and Southeast, magnetite and hematite from Arkansas, crystal quartz from the Ouachita Mountains. Each one was selected for qualities that went beyond mere utility. The copper from the Great Lakes was prized not just for its workability but for its color, a warm reddish gold that catches the light like a living flame. The galena from Missouri had a metallic sheen that made it look like solid silver, and when crushed into powder it could be used as a body paint that transformed the wearer into something shimmering and otherworldly. The soapstone from the Appalachians was soft enough to carve with simple tools, yet durable enough to serve as cooking vessels that could withstand direct contact with fire. The various cherts and flints came in a rainbow of colours, each source producing stone with its own distinctive appearance, so that a knowledgeable observer could identify the origin of a piece of flint simply by its colour and texture, reading the stone the way a modern geologist reads a mineral sample. These materials did not arrive at Poverty Point by accident. They represent deliberate, sustained trade relationships maintained over vast distances. relationships that required planning, negotiation, travel across unfamiliar territory, and a shared understanding of what these materials meant and why they were worth the enormous effort required to obtain them. But Poverty Point is not just about size and imported materials. It is about daily life lived within a monumental landscape. The concentric rings, each of them about 80 feet apart, were not solid walls of earth. They were residential ridges. People lived on top of them. Archaeologists have found the remains of houses, cooking pits, storage areas, and workshop areas along the crests of the ridges, suggesting that the rings served as elevated living platforms that kept people above the seasonal flooding of the nearby bayous. Imagine standing on one of these ridges on a warm autumn evening. The sun is setting behind the great bird mound to the west, casting long golden shadows across the plaza that fills the centre of the ring complex. The plaza itself is enormous, a vast open space large enough to hold thousands of people, and tonight it is alive with activity. Cooking fires send thin columns of smoke into the still air. The smell of roasting fish and venison drifts across the space. Children are running between the ridges, their laughter echoing off the earthen walls. On the ridge where you're standing, a craftsperson is working with a piece of soapstone that has travelled all the way from the Appalachian Mountains. She's carving it into a small owl figurine, her hands moving with practiced precision, the stone dust falling into a neat pile at her feet. Nearby, another craftsperson is shaping small objects from local clay, pressing the soft material into moulds and then baking them in a fire until they are hard. These are called Poverty Point objects, and they are one of the most distinctive artifacts associated with the site. They come in dozens of different shapes, lobed spheres and cylinders and bicanoids and finger-squeezed lumps, and their purpose was entirely practical. In a region where suitable cooking stones are scarce, these clay objects served as substitutes. You would heat them in a fire until they were red hot, then drop them into a pit filled with water and food, and the heat stored in the clay would bring the water to a boil. It is an ingenious solution to a local problem, and the sheer number of Poverty Point objects found at the site, literally millions of them, tells you how many meals were cooked here over the centuries of the site's occupation. But the most extraordinary thing about Poverty Point is what it tells us about the social organisation of its builders. This was not a site that could have been built or maintained by a single family, or even a single band of hunter-gatherers. The construction of the ridges and mounds required coordinated labour on a massive scale. The maintenance of long-distance trade networks required specialists with the knowledge and authority to organise expeditions and negotiate exchanges. The sheer density of population suggested by the residential ridges implies a level of social complexity that we usually associate with agricultural societies, and yet the people of Poverty Point were not primarily farmers. They were fishers and hunters and gatherers who had found a way to support a large, complex, socially stratified community without the agricultural revolution that textbooks tell us was a prerequisite for such things. They broke the rules, or rather, they showed us that the rules we thought we understood about human social development were never really rules at all. They were just assumptions based on the European and Middle Eastern experience that did not account for the creativity and ingenuity of people living in very different environments, with very different resources and very different ideas about how to organise a society. And the trade networks that Poverty Point maintained set the template for everything that followed. The idea that distant places and distant peoples could be connected through the exchange of symbolically charged materials, that identity and meaning could be created and sustained through the movement of objects across vast landscapes, that a community could define itself not just by where it was, but by the web of relationships it maintained with places far beyond the horizon. All of these ideas were present at Poverty Point more than 3,000 years ago. The Hopewell did not need to invent them, they inherited them. So when the Hopewell Interaction Sphere emerged around 200 BC, it was not appearing in a vacuum. It was emerging from a tradition of mound building, long-distance exchange, and shared symbolic practice that was already more than 3,000 years old. The Hopewell did not invent the idea of reshaping the earth. They did not invent the idea of trading precious materials across vast distances. What they did was take these existing traditions and amplify them, refine them, elaborate them, and extend them to a degree that had never been seen before. But between Poverty Point and the Hopewell, there was another chapter, another culture that played a crucial role in building the foundations upon which the Hopewell would construct their remarkable achievement. Archaeologists call them the Adena, and they flourished in the Ohio Valley from roughly 800 BC to about 100 AD, overlapping with the early Hopewell period in their final centuries. The Adena were the first major mound-building culture in the Ohio region, and in many ways they can be thought of as the direct predecessors of the Hopewell. They built conical burial mounds, some of them quite large, throughout the river valleys of what is now Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Indiana. The most famous Adena site is the Grave Creek Mound in present-day Moundsville, West Virginia, a massive conical earthwork that rises nearly 70 feet above the surrounding floodplain and measures about 295 feet in diameter at its base. When it was first excavated in the 19th century, the Grave Creek Mound was the largest conical mound in North America, and even today it remains one of the most impressive. But the Adena contribution to the story goes far beyond the size of their mounds. The Adena developed many of the burial practices that the Hopewell would later elaborate upon. They placed their dead in log-lined tombs beneath earthen mounds, sometimes cremating the bodies first, sometimes leaving them intact. They included grave goods with the burials, objects made from copper, mica, marine shell, and other exotic materials that indicate the existence of trade networks reaching hundreds of miles in multiple directions. They carved tubular smoking pipes from Ohio pipestone, creating elegant forms that the Hopewell would later transform into the naturalistic effigy pipes that are among the masterpieces of ancient American art. And the Adena developed a distinctive artistic style that included elaborately decorated pottery, carved stone tablets bearing geometric and zoomorphic designs, and small figurines that provide some of our best evidence for what the people of this period actually looked like. One of the most famous Adena artifacts is the Adena pipe, a carved effigy figure standing about 8 inches tall, depicting a person wearing ear spools, a loincloth, and an elaborate headdress. The figure's posture is alert and upright, the facial features rendered with a naturalism that gives us the feeling of looking at a real individual rather than a generic representation. The Adena also left us one of the most enigmatic monuments in all of North America, the Great Serpent Mound, a sinuous earthwork nearly a quarter-mile long that winds along a ridge in Adams County, Ohio. The serpent's body undulates in 7 deep curves, and at one end the jaws appear to be open, clasping or disgorging an oval shape that some interpret as an egg, a symbol of creation and rebirth. The dating of the Great Serpent Mound has been debated for decades, with some archaeologists attributing it to the Adena period and others placing it later, in the Fort Ancient period around 1000 to 1200 AD. Whatever its precise date, the Serpent Mound embodies the same impulse that drove all of these mound-building cultures, the desire to inscribe meaning into the landscape itself, to create forms so large that they can only be fully appreciated from the sky, to communicate with forces and beings that exist on a scale beyond ordinary human perception. The Adena also appear to have been the first people in the Ohio Valley to experiment with the cultivation of certain native plants, including sunflower, sumpweed, chenopodium, and squash. This is not full-scale agriculture in the way we might think of it. They were not clearing vast fields and planting rows of crops. They were tending wild plants, encouraging their growth near their camps and villages, gradually selecting for larger seeds and more productive varieties over many generations. This slow, patient process of plant domestication, sometimes called the Eastern Agricultural Complex, would eventually provide the Hopewell and their successors with a reliable supplementary food source that helped support the larger gatherings and more complex social organization required to build and maintain the great earthwork complexes. Let me take you to the Great Serpent Mound for a moment, because it is one of those places where the past feels close enough to touch. The mound is located on a plateau above Brush Creek in Adams County, Ohio, and the setting is almost as remarkable as the mound itself. The plateau sits above a crypto-explosion structure, a geological formation created either by a meteorite impact or by a volcanic event hundreds of millions of years ago. The disturbed bedrock beneath the serpent has been folded and fractured into unusual patterns, creating a landscape that would have seemed geologically charged to ancient peoples, attuned to the subtle qualities of different places. You're walking along the edge of the plateau on a late autumn afternoon, the trees ablaze with colour, the maples and oaks and hickories turning the hillsides into tapestries of red and gold and russet. The air is cool and crisp, carrying the smell of fallen leaves and damp earth. Below you, Brush Creek winds through its narrow valley, the water dark and reflective, carrying the colours of the trees on its surface like a moving painting, and then you see it. At first, from ground level, it looks like a low ridge of earth, no more than 3 or 4 feet high, curving gently through the grass. But as you follow it, the curve continues and continues and continues, unwinding like the body of an enormous animal frozen in mid-movement. The body undulates in deep S-curves, 7 of them, each one a smooth mathematical arc that flows seamlessly into the next. At the western end, the curves tighten and the body coils into a tight spiral, the tail of the serpent wound upon itself like a watch spring. At the eastern end, the jaws open wide, forming a shape that archaeologists have debated for over a century. Is it an egg? A frog? The sun? Whatever it represents, the open-jawed serpent appears to be either swallowing it or disgorging it, and either interpretation carries profound symbolic weight. Swallowing suggests consumption, death, the taking of life into the earth. Disgorging suggests creation, birth, the emergence of new life from the body of the great serpent. From the air, the full shape is breathtaking, a sinuous line of earth nearly a quarter-mile long, laid out with the confidence and precision of a master artist, working on a canvas that happened to be the surface of the earth. The serpent seems to move, even in stillness. The curves give it a sense of propulsion, of energy barely contained, as if it might at any moment uncoil and slide down the hillside and into the creek below. Whatever culture built the Great Serpent Mound, and whenever they built it, they created something that transcends its specific historical context. The serpent is a universal symbol, appearing in the mythologies and art of cultures around the world, associated with water, with the underworld, with transformation, with the shedding of old skin and the emergence of new life. The builders of this mound tapped into something deep in the human psyche, something that resonates across cultures and across millennia, and they expressed it in a form so powerful that it still stops visitors in their tracks today, still provokes wonder, still raises the hair on the backs of necks, still makes people look up at the sky and down at the earth and feel, for just a moment, the mysterious connection between the two. Think of the Adena as the rehearsal before the main performance. They developed the themes, the motifs, the techniques, and the traditions that the Hopewell would take and amplify to an extraordinary degree. Without the Adena, there could have been no Hopewell. The foundation was laid stone by stone, basket of earth by basket of earth, generation by generation, in the quiet valleys of the Ohio country during the centuries before the Common Era. Now, let me paint a picture for you of what the Hopewell heartland actually looked like at its peak. Imagine yourself back in that Ohio valley, but this time let me fill in more details. The year is around 100 AD, and you are approaching the complex that archaeologists will one day call the Newark Earthworks. As you walk through the forest, the trees begin to thin, and you notice that the undergrowth has been cleared. The forest floor is open and park-like, maintained by generations of careful burning that has kept the brush down and encouraged the growth of nut-bearing trees like hickory and oak and walnut. The people here are not just living in the forest, they are managing it, shaping it, turning it into a more productive version of itself, and then the trees open up completely and you see the earthworks for the first time. What stretches before you is a geometric landscape so vast that you literally cannot take it all in at once. The Newark Earthworks originally covered more than 4 square miles of land. 4 square miles of precisely shaped geometric enclosures connected by long parallel walls. At the centre of the complex is a perfect circle, now known as the Great Circle, with an interior ditch and walls that rise about 14 feet above the surrounding terrain. The circle encloses an area of about 30 acres. Connected to this circle by a long corridor of parallel earthen walls is a perfect octagon, the Octagon Earthworks, enclosing about 50 acres. And stretching away from these central features are additional circles, squares and ellipses, connected by more parallel walls, spreading across the landscape in a pattern that seems to combine mathematical precision with deep astronomical knowledge. Because the Newark Earthworks are not just big, they are not just geometrically precise, they are aligned to the movements of the moon. Specifically, the Octagon Earthworks track what is known as the lunar standstill cycle, an 18.5-year period during which the moon's rising and setting points shift gradually along the horizon, reaching maximum and minimum positions before reversing direction. This is an extremely subtle astronomical phenomenon. It takes almost 2 decades to complete a single cycle, and yet the builders of the Newark Earthworks encoded this cycle into their earthen architecture with remarkable precision, aligning the walls and openings of the octagon to the 8 key positions of the lunar standstill. Modern astronomers have confirmed these alignments using sophisticated equipment and calculations. The ancient builders achieved them using nothing but careful observation sustained over generations. Think about what that means. It means that someone, or more likely many someones over many generations, was watching the moon rise and set night after night, year after year, decade after decade, recording its positions, comparing those positions over time, recognizing the pattern, understanding the mathematics of the cycle, and then translating all of that accumulated knowledge into a physical form, a building made of earth that would preserve and communicate that knowledge for future generations. That is not the work of simple people. That is the work of brilliant, patient, deeply committed people who cared about understanding the universe they lived in and who found ways to encode that understanding in forms that would outlast any individual human life. Let that sink in for a moment as you drift deeper into relaxation. Somewhere in ancient Ohio, people were watching the moon with such devotion, such patience, such meticulous attention to detail, that they could predict where it would rise on the horizon decades into the future. And they did not write any of this down. They could not write it down because they had no writing system. Instead, they encoded it into the earth itself. The octagon became their textbook. The earthen walls became their astronomical tables. The alignments became their equations. Every opening, every angle, every sight line was a piece of information preserved in a form that would endure for centuries. And it was not just the moon. The Hopewell Earthworks show alignments to solar events as well. The summer and winter solstices, the equinoxes, the cross-quarter days that fall midway between solstices and equinoxes. Some researchers have suggested that the Newark Earthworks encode a complete unified astronomical system, a way of tracking both solar and lunar cycles simultaneously, using the geometry of circles and octagons and squares to represent relationships between celestial bodies that Western astronomy did not fully formalize until centuries later. Ray Hively and Robert Horn, 2 physicists from Earlham College who studied the Newark Earthworks in the 1980s, demonstrated that the octagon's alignments to the lunar standstill positions were far too precise to be coincidental. The probability of the alignments occurring by chance was essentially zero. Someone had designed this structure with a deep understanding of positional astronomy and the mathematical relationships between geometric forms, and they had done it using nothing more sophisticated than wooden posts, stretched cords, and the patient accumulation of observational data gathered over many human lifetimes. The Newark Earthworks were not the only site with astronomical alignments. The High Bank Works, another Hopewell earthwork complex located about 60 miles south of Newark, along the Scioto River, contains a circle and octagon combination that mirrors the Newark site in both form and astronomical orientation. The 2 sites are so similar that some archaeologists believe they were designed by the same community of specialists, master geometers, and astronomers whose knowledge was preserved and transmitted across generations through oral tradition and the physical forms of the earthworks themselves. Imagine being one of these specialists. Imagine spending your entire life learning the positions of the moon and the sun, mastering the geometry of circles and octagons, understanding how to translate celestial knowledge into earthen form. You would have begun your training as a child, accompanying your elders to the earthworks on significant nights, learning to identify the key positions on the horizon where the moon rises and sets at the extremes of its cycle. You would have spent years, decades perhaps, watching and recording and comparing, building up the body of knowledge that would eventually allow you to design or modify an earthwork complex. And when you grew old, you would have passed that knowledge to the next generation, your students, your apprentices, who would carry it forward and add their own observations to the growing body of understanding. This is how knowledge accumulates in an oral society, not through books or libraries or universities, but through the living chain of teacher and student, elder and youth, stretching back through the generations like the parallel walls of the earthworks themselves, each link in the chain both receiving what came before and contributing something new before passing it on. And the Newark Earthworks are just one site among hundreds. The Hopewell Heartland in southern Ohio alone contains dozens of major earthwork complexes, including the famous site of Hopewell Mound Group, which gave the entire culture its modern name, and Fort Ancient sits on a high bluff overlooking the Little Miami River in Warren County, Ohio, and its earthen walls extend for more than 3.5 miles along the edges of the bluff, enclosing about 100 acres of hilltop terrain. The walls are punctuated by dozens of openings, gaps in the earthwork that serve as entrances and that are aligned to various astronomical events. Stone-lined pathways lead from some of these openings down the steep bluff face to the river below, connecting the hilltop ceremonial space to the water that flows past its base. Standing on the bluff at Fort Ancient on a summer evening, you can look out over miles of forested river valley, the Little Miami River winding through the landscape below like a silver ribbon laid across green velvet. The setting sun turns the river to gold, and the shadows of the earthen walls stretch long across the hilltop, pointing toward the places on the horizon where the stars will soon appear. It is a place that feels sacred even now, even to modern visitors who may know nothing of its history. There is a quality of attention in the landscape, a feeling of being watched, or perhaps of being invited to watch, to look more carefully at the sky and the earth, and the relationship between them. Further south, along the Scioto River near the modern city of Chillicothe, the concentration of Hopewell Earthworks is staggering. Within a radius of about 15 miles of Chillicothe, there are more than a dozen major earthwork complexes, including Mound City, the Hopewell Mound Group, Sipe Earthworks, Bomb Earthworks, and several others. Archaeologists sometimes refer to this area as the Hopewell Core, the geographic heart of the entire interaction sphere, the place where the tradition seems to have reached its fullest and most elaborate expression. The density of earthworks in this relatively small area suggests that the Scioto Valley held a special significance within the Hopewell world, perhaps as a kind of pilgrimage destination, a place where people from across the network gathered for the most important ceremonies and the most elaborate burials. At the Tremper Mound site, located along the Scioto River about 10 miles south of Chillicothe, archaeologists made one of the most extraordinary discoveries in the history of Hopewell research. Within a single mound, they found a cache of more than 130 effigy pipes, representing dozens of different animal species, all deliberately broken and deposited together in what appears to have been a single massive ceremonial event. The pipes had been smoked, used in ceremonies over a period of years or perhaps decades, and then intentionally destroyed and buried together. The deliberate destruction of objects that had clearly required enormous skill and time to create is one of the most thought-provoking aspects of Hopewell ceremonial practice. It suggests that the act of creation was not the end goal. The pipes were not made to be preserved or displayed or hoarded. They were made to be used in ceremony, to serve their sacred purpose, and then to be returned to the earth. The value lay not in the objects themselves, but in the relationships they embodied, the relationships between the carver and the stone, between the smoker and the animal spirit, between the living and the dead, between the human world and the world of powers that existed just beyond the edge of ordinary perception. To modern eyes, trained by a culture that values possession and accumulation, the deliberate destruction of beautiful objects seems wasteful, even shocking. But to the Hopewell, it may have been the most meaningful thing they could do, to give something back, to return what had been borrowed, to complete the cycle of creation and dissolution that mirrors the cycle of life and death itself. At the Marietta Earthworks in southeastern Ohio, where the Muskingum River joins the Ohio, the Hopewell built another impressive complex of geometric enclosures that was among the first to be documented by European-American settlers in the late 18th century. The Marietta Earthworks included a large square enclosure, a conical mound surrounded by a moat, and connecting walls that linked these features into a unified ceremonial landscape. The early settlers of Marietta, to their credit, recognized the significance of the earthworks and took steps to preserve some of them, incorporating the largest mound, now known as Conus, into the town cemetery, and maintaining the square enclosure as a public park. These preserved fragments give modern visitors a glimpse of what the Hopewell landscape must have looked like when it was intact, when the earthworks were not isolated remnants surrounded by modern development, but part of a continuous sacred geography that extended across hundreds of square miles. The equally impressive Fort Ancient site, which despite its name has nothing to do with military defense and everything to do with ceremony and astronomical observation. Mound City, another major Hopewell site along the Scioto River, contains at least 24 burial mounds enclosed within a rectangular earthen wall covering 13 acres. When archaeologists excavated these mounds in the 19th and 20th centuries, what they found inside astonished them. Buried with the dead were objects of extraordinary beauty and craftsmanship, made from materials that had travelled enormous distances to reach this spot. Sheets of mica, a glittering mineral that can be split into paper-thin transparent layers, had been cut into elaborate shapes, silhouettes of human hands, bird talons, headless bodies, serpents, and geometric designs. The mica came from the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina, hundreds of miles to the southeast. Obsidian, volcanic glass that can be knapped into blades sharper than any modern surgical scalpel, had been fashioned into enormous ceremonial bifaces, some of them more than a foot long, far too large and too finely made for any practical use. The obsidian came from Yellowstone, in what is now Wyoming, nearly 1,500 miles to the west. Copper, obtained from the native copper deposits around Lake Superior, had been hammered into breastplates, ear spools, panpipes, headdress ornaments, and elaborate cutout designs depicting birds of prey with outstretched wings. The copperwork is some of the most technically accomplished metalwork produced anywhere in the ancient Americas, and it was achieved entirely through cold hammering and annealing, repeatedly heating and cooling the metal to prevent it from becoming brittle. Shells from the Gulf of Mexico, over 700 miles to the south, had been fashioned into beads, cups, and gorgets, ornamental pendants worn at the throat. Shark teeth and barracuda jaws from the Atlantic and Gulf coasts were included in burial offerings. Bear teeth, sometimes hundreds of them in a single burial, were arranged into necklaces and bracelets. Freshwater pearls, thousands of them, had been drilled and strung into elaborate ornaments or heaped in piles alongside the dead. Galena crystals from Missouri, their surfaces catching the light like tiny mirrors. Pipestone carved into some of the most extraordinary sculptures ever produced in ancient North America. Effigy pipes depicting animals with a naturalism and attention to detail that would not be surpassed for centuries. Hawks and eagles with every feather rendered. Frogs crouching with their legs tucked beneath them. Bears and beavers and otters captured in poses so lifelike they seem ready to move. Let me linger on the artistry for a moment, because it deserves your full attention, even as your eyes grow heavier and your body sinks deeper into comfort. The effigy pipes of the Hopewell are among the most remarkable works of art produced anywhere in the ancient world, and I do not make that statement lightly. Carved from Ohio pipestone, a fine-grained stone that ranges in colour from light grey to deep reddish-brown, these pipes depict animals with a naturalism that borders on the scientific. The hawk pipes show every detail of the raptor's plumage, the fierce curve of the beak, the powerful grip of the talons, the way the feathers overlap in precise rows along the wings. The toad pipes capture the warty texture of the skin, the bulging eyes, the way the hind legs tuck beneath the body in that characteristic crouching posture. There are pipes depicting great blue herons standing tall with their long necks extended. Pipes showing beavers gnawing on sticks, their flat tails rendered with careful attention to the crosshatch pattern of the scales. Pipes depicting bears with their massive shoulders hunched, their small eyes peering out from beneath heavy brows. River otters sleek and playful. Bobcats alert and watchful. Ducks with their bills tucked against their breasts. Each one is a portrait, not of a generic animal, but of a specific creature observed with the loving attention of someone who had spent many hours watching these animals in their natural habitats. The bowl of each pipe is carved into the animal's back, so that when the pipe was in use, the smoker would be gazing directly into the face of the animal effigy, while drawing smoke through the stem. Some scholars believe that the act of smoking these pipes was a ritual practice designed to facilitate communication with animal spirits, that the smoke itself was a medium through which the boundary between the human and animal worlds could be temporarily dissolved. The pipe smoker was not just consuming tobacco, or whatever mixture of plants was being used. The pipe smoker was entering into a relationship with the animal depicted on the pipe, drawing the animal's power and wisdom into their own body with each breath. Beyond the pipes, the Hopewell created copper art of extraordinary sophistication. They used a technique called repoussé, in which thin sheets of copper are worked from behind to create raised designs on the front surface. The results are breathtaking. Copper falcon plates show birds of prey with outstretched wings spanning a foot or more, every feather individually defined, the eyes fierce and commanding. Copper headdress ornaments feature abstract designs of interlocking curves and spirals that seem to pulse with energy. Copper ear spools, circular ornaments worn in pierced earlobes, were made in matched pairs and polished to a mirror shine that would have caught and reflected firelight during nighttime ceremonies. Some of these ear spools are covered with thin sheets of silver or iron meteorite, materials so rare and so difficult to work that their inclusion in personal ornaments speaks to a level of metallurgical skill and aesthetic refinement that is truly remarkable. And then there are the mica cutouts. Mica is a mineral that can be split into sheets so thin they are nearly transparent, and the Hopewell exploited this property to create objects of haunting beauty. Large sheets of mica were cut into silhouettes of human hands, some of them life-sized, the fingers spread wide as if reaching for something just beyond grasp. Other cutouts depict headless human figures, bird talons, serpents, and geometric shapes. When held up to the light, these mica silhouettes become translucent, glowing with an inner luminosity that must have been profoundly meaningful in the context of ceremonies conducted by firelight. Imagine a priest or shaman holding a mica hand silhouette up before a blazing fire, the thin mineral sheet glowing like amber, the shape of the hand projected in shadow and light onto the faces of the gathered crowd. The effect would have been mesmerizing. The boundary between the material and the immaterial, between the solid and the transparent, between the earthly and the otherworldly, would have seemed to dissolve in that golden glow. The Hopewell also worked with materials that modern archaeologists can barely explain. At the Hopewell Mound group itself, excavators found deposits of obsidian so large that they could only have resulted from the accumulation of hundreds of individual blades and bifaces, broken and whole, deposited over many years of ceremonial activity. One cache alone contained over 200 pounds of obsidian, 200 pounds of volcanic glass, every ounce of it transported 1,500 miles from its source in Yellowstone. The sheer quantity of material is staggering, and it raises questions that archaeologists are still struggling to answer. How many individual journeys does 200 pounds of obsidian represent? How many people were involved in transporting it? How long did it take to accumulate? And what did it mean to the people who gathered it here, in this mound, in this place, so far from the volcanic landscape where it was born? At another major site, the Seep Earthworks along Paint Creek in Ross County, Ohio, archaeologists uncovered one of the most spectacular Hopewell burials ever found. The central burial feature contained the remains of several individuals accompanied by thousands of freshwater pearls, hundreds of copper ornaments, stacks of mica sheets, obsidian blades, marine shell cups, and other objects that together represent an almost incomprehensible investment of labour, skill, and long-distance exchange. The pearls alone, thousands of them, each one individually drilled and strung, would have taken years to accumulate. And each pearl had to be found in the rivers and streams of the interior, pried from its muscle shell, inspected for quality, drilled with a tiny stone or bone drill, and strung on a cord of plant fibre or sinew. The patience required is almost beyond imagining. But then, patience is one of the qualities that defined the Hopewell more than anything else. Patience to watch the moon for 18.5 years. Patience to carry earth in baskets to build walls that stretch for miles. Patience to maintain trade relationships spanning 1,500 miles. Patience to drill thousands of freshwater pearls one at a time. Patience to carve a pipe into a perfect likeness of a hawk, working the stone grain by grain until every feather was just right. These were people who understood that the most meaningful things in life cannot be rushed, that the most enduring achievements require sustained commitment across many generations, that the deepest truths reveal themselves only to those who are willing to wait and watch and listen. Now here is the question that should be forming in your mind as I describe all of this. How? How did obsidian from Yellowstone end up in a burial mound in Ohio? How did mica from North Carolina and copper from Lake Superior and shells from the Gulf of Mexico all converge on the same spot? The distances involved are staggering. We are talking about a trade network, or more accurately an exchange network, that spanned the better part of a continent. And what makes it even more remarkable is that the materials being exchanged were, for the most part, not utilitarian. People were not trading for food or tools or building materials. They were trading for mica, obsidian, copper, shells, crystals, and other materials that had primarily symbolic or ceremonial value. These were prestige goods, sacred goods, materials that carried meaning far beyond their practical usefulness. The obsidian blades were too big and too beautiful to actually use for cutting. The copper ornaments were too elaborate for everyday wear. The mica cutouts were too fragile for anything except ceremony. These objects were made to be placed in the earth with the honoured dead, to accompany them on whatever journey the Hopewell believed followed this life, and that tells us something crucial about the nature of the Hopewell Interaction Sphere. It was not primarily an economic network, although economics certainly played a role. It was a spiritual network, a network of shared beliefs and shared practices centered around death, burial, transformation, and renewal. The earthworks were the sacred spaces where these beliefs were enacted. The exotic materials were the physical embodiments of connections between distant places, between the living and the dead, between the earth and the sky, between the ordinary world and whatever extraordinary world lay beyond it. Let me help you imagine what one of these ceremonies might have looked like. The night is cool and clear, and you are standing inside the Great Circle at Newark. Hundreds of people have gathered here, many of them having travelled for days or even weeks from distant communities. Fires are burning at intervals along the interior of the earthen walls, their light flickering against the packed earth surfaces and casting long shadows across the enclosed space. The air smells of wood smoke and sage and something else, something sweet and unfamiliar, perhaps a resin being burned as incense. In the centre of the enclosure, a group of individuals is preparing a burial. The body has been treated with great care, perhaps laid out on a specially prepared clay floor within a charnel house for months or even years before this final ceremony. Now the bones are being gathered, cleaned, painted with red ochre, the colour of life and blood and transformation, and arranged on a low platform surrounded by offerings. You can see the gleam of copper in the firelight, the shimmer of mica, the deep black glass of obsidian blades arranged in fans around the body. Freshwater pearls are heaped in piles, shell beads are draped over and around the bones. Somewhere in the darkness, someone begins to play a set of copper panpipes, and the sound that emerges is unlike anything you have heard before, haunting and resonant and impossibly beautiful. The notes hanging in the still night air like something halfway between music and prayer. Other voices join in, not singing exactly, but chanting, a low rhythmic vocalization that rises and falls like breathing, like the pulse of the earth itself. The sound fills the great enclosure and seems to rise up the earthen walls and spill out into the sky, where the moon is rising at its farthest northern point along the horizon, a position it reaches only once every 18.5 years. And you realize that this ceremony has been timed to coincide with this lunar event, that the alignment of the earthworks and the timing of the burial and the gathering of all these people from all these distant places has been coordinated with the movements of the heavens themselves, that what is happening here tonight is not just a funeral. It is a moment when the earth and the sky and the living and the dead are all brought into alignment, when the geometry of the earthworks and the geometry of the cosmos are temporarily, perfectly, one and the same thing. The ceremony continues for hours. Different groups take their turns approaching the burial platform, each one bringing their own offerings, their own songs, their own prayers in their own language. Because this is one of the most remarkable things about these gatherings. The people who have come here tonight do not all speak the same language. They come from communities scattered across hundreds of miles, communities that have their own distinct languages, their own local traditions, their own ways of preparing food and building houses and decorating their bodies. And yet they share this. They share the earthworks and the ceremonies and the symbolic language of copper and mica and obsidian and shell. They share the understanding that the dead must be honoured with the most precious things the living can offer. They share the belief that the geometry of the earth and the geometry of the sky are connected, that what happens here in this enclosure on this night is in some sense a reflection of what is happening in the cosmos above. The symbolic language of the Hopewell was remarkably consistent across vast distances. Certain motifs appear again and again throughout the interaction sphere, in sites separated by hundreds or even thousands of miles. The raptor, the bird of prey with outstretched wings, appears on copper plates in Ohio, and on shell gorgets in Tennessee and on pottery in Illinois. The hand-eye motif, a human hand with an eye in the palm, appears in several distant locations. Serpentine forms, often associated with water and the underworld, recur throughout the network. The forked eye design, a pattern of lines radiating from the eye that resembles the facial markings of a peregrine falcon, appears on human figurines and masks across a wide area. These shared symbols tell us that the Hopewell Interaction Sphere was not just about the exchange of materials. It was about the exchange of ideas, of stories, of ways of understanding the world. The materials were important not for their own sake, but because they served as vehicles for meaning. A piece of obsidian was not just a piece of volcanic glass. It was a piece of the western mountains, a fragment of fire and earth. carrying the power and the mystery of a landscape so distant that most people in Ohio would never see it with their own eyes. A copper plate was not just a sheet of metal. It was a piece of the north, of the great lake that stretched beyond the horizon, of the ancient rock that had been shaped by forces older than memory. A sheet of mica was not just a mineral. It was a window between worlds, a substance that was simultaneously opaque and transparent, solid and ethereal, of the earth and of the light. Each material had its own story, its own associations, its own place in the symbolic geography of the Hopewell world. And when these materials were gathered together in a burial mound, brought from the four corners of the known world and placed alongside the honoured dead, they created a kind of symbolic map, a miniature representation of the entire network, the entire web of relationships and meanings that constituted the Hopewell Interaction Sphere. The dead person was being sent into the afterlife equipped with the entire world, wrapped in the connections of an entire continent, accompanied by the prayers and the craftsmanship and the sacrifice of communities spanning from the Rockies to the Atlantic. That is not poverty. That is not simplicity. That is one of the most generous and beautiful funeral traditions ever devised by human beings anywhere on this planet. As the night deepens and the fires burn lower, the chanting grows softer, more meditative, more like breathing than singing. The moon has risen high now, its cold white light supplementing the warm orange glow of the embers. The shadows in the enclosure have shifted, lengthened, and the earthen walls seem taller in the darkness, more imposing, more like the walls of a passage between this world and whatever comes next. One by one, the assembled mourners begin to cover the burial with earth. Each person carries a handful, a basketful, adding it to the growing mound that will eventually seal the burial beneath a dome of soil. The act is communal, shared, each person contributing their own small portion to the collective effort, just as each community contributed its own materials and its own prayers to the ceremony. And as the earth rises over the burial, something remarkable happens. The individual disappears. The specific person who lived and breathed and laughed and loved is gradually absorbed into the earth, into the mound, into the landscape itself. They become part of the sacred geography of this place, part of the earthwork complex that will endure for thousands of years after the last mourner has gone home, the last fire has burned out, the last notes of the copper panpipes have faded into the night air. This is the Hopewell Interaction Sphere at its most profound. Not a trade network, not an empire, not a political alliance, something deeper, something harder to name but perhaps more powerful than any of those things. A shared understanding of how the universe works and how human beings fit within it, expressed through earthen architecture that mirrors the sky, through materials gathered from the farthest reaches of the known world, through ceremonies that bind communities separated by thousands of miles into a single web of meaning. But how did this network actually function on a practical level? How did obsidian travel 1,500 miles from Yellowstone to Ohio? How did people separated by such enormous distances maintain the relationships necessary to keep these exchange networks operating for century after century? The honest answer is that we do not know for certain. The Hopewell left no written records. Everything we know about them comes from the archaeological record, from the things they built and the objects they made and the way they buried their dead. But based on that evidence, and on comparisons with historically documented exchange networks among indigenous peoples, archaeologists have proposed several models for how the Hopewell Interaction Sphere might have operated. One possibility is that materials moved through a chain of intermediate exchanges. Obsidian from Yellowstone might have passed through the hands of a dozen different communities on its journey to Ohio, each exchange strengthening a relationship between neighbouring groups, each handoff adding another layer of social meaning to the material. By the time a piece of Yellowstone obsidian reached the Scioto Valley, it would have carried the accumulated social weight of every transaction it had passed through, every relationship it had cemented, every hand that had held it. Another possibility is that at least some of the long-distance exchange was conducted by specialists, individuals, or small groups who made extended journeys to obtain specific materials from their sources. These might have been people of special status within their communities, individuals who had the knowledge, the connections, and the spiritual authority to undertake such journeys. Ethnographic accounts from later periods describe exactly this kind of long-distance travel among indigenous peoples, with individuals travelling hundreds of miles to obtain sacred materials or to participate in ceremonies at distant locations. Let me walk you through one possible journey a journey that might have taken place sometime around 100 AD, just to give you a sense of what maintaining these networks actually involved on a human level. Imagine a small group of travellers, perhaps 4 or 5 people, setting out from a community in the Scioto Valley of Ohio on a journey to obtain copper from the Lake Superior region. The distance, as the crow flies, is roughly 500 miles. But these travellers are not crows. They are walking, following river valleys and portage routes that add considerably to the total distance, and they are carrying supplies for a journey that will take weeks in each direction. They set out in late spring when the rivers are high and travel by canoe is feasible for some stretches of the route. Their birch bark canoe, lightweight but sturdy, can be carried overland during the portages between river systems. They paddle north along the Scioto River to its headwaters, then portage overland to the tributaries of Lake Erie. They follow the southern shore of Lake Erie westward, stopping at communities along the way, communities where they are known, where relationships have been maintained for generations, where they are welcomed and fed and given information about conditions further along the route. At each stop they exchange small gifts, tokens of ongoing friendship and alliance, a few freshwater pearls from the rivers of Ohio, a small piece of pipestone, a handful of shark teeth that arrived in the Scioto Valley from the Gulf Coast through other hands, other exchanges, other relationships. In return they receive food for the next leg of their journey, guidance about the best routes, perhaps a companion who will travel with them for a stretch and introduce them to the next community along the way. This is how the network functions on the ground level, not through anonymous market transactions, but through personal relationships maintained over generations, not through the cold logic of supply and demand, but through the warm obligations of friendship and reciprocity and shared identity. After weeks of travel, they reach the Quinault Peninsula, a finger of land that juts out into the southern shore of Lake Superior. Here, exposed by ancient geological forces, are deposits of native copper so pure that it can be worked directly without smelting, something almost unique in the natural world. The copper lies in veins and nodules within the basalt bedrock, and extracting it requires patience and skill. The travellers spend days at the copper sources, heating the rock face with fires and then dousing it with cold water to crack it, prying out nuggets and sheets of copper with stone hammers and wooden wedges. They work alongside local people who have been mining this copper for thousands of years, people who know every vein and every outcrop, who can read the rock the way a farmer reads soil. The travellers will not carry the raw copper all the way back to Ohio in its unworked state. That would be too heavy. Instead, they will work it here at the source, hammering the nuggets into thin sheets and rough shapes that can be finished by the specialist artisans back home. They heat the copper in fires and hammer it on stone anvils, folding it and hammering it again, annealing it to keep it workable, gradually transforming the raw material into something portable and precious. When they finally begin the return journey, weeks later, they carry with them perhaps 20 or 30 pounds of worked copper, enough to supply the ceremonial needs of their community for months or even years. They also carry something less tangible but equally valuable: news, stories, information about conditions in the north, about the health and prosperity of distant communities, about marriages and births and deaths, about the movements of game animals and the timing of the seasons. They carry the living substance of the network itself, the human connections that keep it breathing. And this scene, or something very much like it, was playing out simultaneously along dozens of different routes, in dozens of different directions, involving dozens of different materials. While our copper seekers were making their way to Lake Superior, other groups were travelling to the Appalachian Mountains for mica. Others were heading to the Yellowstone Plateau for obsidian, a journey so long and so arduous that it must have taken months and required passage through the territories of many different peoples, each relationship carefully cultivated, each boundary respectfully negotiated. Others were travelling south to the Gulf Coast for marine shells, whelk shells and conch shells, and the small olivella shells that were strung into thousands of beads. Others were heading to the crystal quartz deposits of Arkansas, or the galena sources of Missouri, or the flint quarries of Indiana and Illinois. The materials flowed toward the Hopewell heartland in Ohio from every direction, like rivers flowing toward a great inland sea, and at the centre of that sea, in the earthwork complexes of the Scioto and Paint Creek and the Muskingum and the Licking River valleys, the materials were transformed by master artisans into the objects that would accompany the honoured dead into the earth. The truth probably involves elements of both models, and probably other mechanisms as well that we have not yet identified. What we can say with confidence is that the network was real, that it was extensive, that it lasted for centuries, and that it moved enormous quantities of material over enormous distances. And perhaps most importantly, we can say that the network was maintained not by coercion, but by mutual benefit, by shared belief, by the irresistible pull of a symbolic system that made sense of the world in ways that resonated with people across a vast and diverse landscape. The Hopewell Interaction Sphere reached its peak between about 1 AD and 300 AD. During this period, the earthwork construction was at its most ambitious, the burial offerings were at their most elaborate, and the range of exotic materials reaching the Ohio heartland was at its widest. But even at its peak, the Hopewell Interaction Sphere was not a unified political entity. There was no Hopewell capital, no Hopewell king, no Hopewell army. The term Hopewell itself is a modern archaeological label, taken from the name of a 19th century landowner on whose property one of the major mound groups was located. The people who built these earthworks and maintained these exchange networks would not have recognized the name. They probably did not think of themselves as belonging to a single culture or a single people. They were members of many different communities speaking different languages, living in different environments, pursuing different subsistence strategies. Let me describe what daily life might have looked like for an ordinary Hopewell community, far from the great earthwork centres, in the years around 150 AD. Imagine a small settlement along a tributary of the Scioto River in southern Ohio. The community consists of perhaps 40 or 50 people, several extended families living in a cluster of oval houses made of bent saplings covered with bark and woven mats. The houses are small by modern standards, perhaps 15 feet long and 10 feet wide, but they are warm in winter and cool in summer, and each one contains a central hearth where a small fire burns almost constantly, providing heat and light and a place to cook. The air around the settlement smells of wood smoke and cooking food, a rich, savoury aroma that makes your stomach tighten with hunger. Somewhere nearby, a dog barks, one of the small domesticated dogs that have accompanied human communities in North America for thousands of years, their ancestors having crossed Beringia alongside the first human migrants. Children's voices carry through the trees, high and bright and full of that particular energy that children everywhere seem to possess. The energy of bodies that have not yet learned to be tired. An older woman sits near the entrance to one of the houses, weaving a mat from dried cattail leaves, her fingers moving with the automatic precision of someone who has performed this task 10,000 times. A young man is napping a piece of Flint Ridge flint, the distinctive multicoloured chert that comes from quarries about 60 miles to the east. The flint is extraordinary, ranging in colour from translucent honey gold to deep crimson to pale blue-grey, sometimes all within a single piece, and it naps beautifully, producing thin, sharp flakes with minimal effort. The sound of his work carries across the settlement, a rhythmic tap-tap-tap that punctuates the general hum of community life. Near the river, several men are checking fish traps, woven baskets of river cane that have been set in the shallows to catch the abundant bass and catfish and drum that populate these waters. The catch is good today, and they carry the fish back to the settlement in bark-lined baskets, the silver bodies still flexing and curving, still holding on to the last moments of their lives in the water. A woman receives the fish and begins cleaning them with a sharp mussel-shell knife, the scales catching the light as they fall away, each one a tiny iridescent mirror. The settlement is surrounded by gardens, not vast fields of a single crop, but small plots scattered through the forest clearings and along the riverbank, where women tend a variety of plants that have been domesticated or semi-domesticated over many centuries. Sunflowers grow in tall golden rows, their heavy heads drooping with seeds that will be harvested and stored for winter. Squash vines sprawl across the ground, their broad leaves shading the soil and conserving moisture. Chenopodium, a leafy plant related to modern quinoa, grows in dense stands that produce tiny nutritious seeds by the thousands. Sumpweed, another seed crop, grows alongside it. These plants do not provide the majority of the community's calories. Most of the food still comes from hunting, fishing, and gathering wild plants. But the gardens provide a reliable supplement, a buffer against lean times, and the surplus they produce can be stored and used to support the community during the periods of intense ceremonial activity at the earthwork centres. The men of the community are skilled hunters who pursue white-tailed deer through the managed forests, using bows and arrows tipped with finely napped flint points. They also hunt smaller game, rabbits and squirrels and wild turkey, and they fish the rivers and streams using nets, traps, and bonefish hooks. In autumn, everyone participates in the nut harvest, gathering hickory nuts and walnuts and acorns from the trees that have been encouraged to grow in dense stands around the settlement through generations of selective burning and management. The nuts are processed using heavy stone mortars and pestles, the shells cracked and the meats extracted and either eaten fresh or dried and stored in bark-lined pits for winter use. Life follows the rhythm of the seasons. Spring brings the planting of gardens, the return of migratory birds, the spawning runs of fish in the rivers. Summer is a time of growth and abundance, of fishing and foraging and tending the gardens. Autumn brings the harvest, the nut gathering, the deer hunts that provide meat and hides for the approaching cold months. Winter is a time of storytelling and craftsmanship, of long evenings spent around the fire while skilled hands shape pipestone into effigy pipes, nap flint into delicate points, weave fibres into cordage and textiles, and carve bone and antler into tools and ornaments. But several times a year, the rhythm of daily life is interrupted by something extraordinary. Word comes, carried by runners or by travellers passing through, that a gathering is being organised at one of the great earthworks centres. Perhaps a burial ceremony is planned for an important person who has died. Perhaps it is time for one of the regular seasonal celebrations that mark the solstices or equinoxes. Perhaps a delegation from a distant community has arrived with exotic materials, and the gathering is an opportunity for exchange and renewal of alliances. Whatever the occasion, the community begins to prepare. Food is gathered and packed for the journey. Ceremonial garments are brought out from storage, copper ornaments polished until they gleam, shell necklaces restrung, feathered mantles shaken free of dust. The journey to the nearest major earthwork centre might take 1 or 2 days of walking, following well-worn trails through the forest and along the riverbanks. When the community arrives at the earthwork complex, they find that dozens of other communities have arrived as well, setting up temporary camps around the perimeter of the earthworks, cooking fires sending columns of smoke into the sky from every direction. The atmosphere is festive but also solemn, a combination of reunion and ritual that brings together the practical and the sacred in a way that modern people might find unfamiliar but deeply moving. Old friends greet each other, news is exchanged, marriages are arranged, disputes are mediated. And throughout it all, the earthworks themselves stand as silent witnesses. Their precise geometric forms a reminder that this gathering is connected to something larger than any individual community, something that encompasses the entire network of peoples and places and ideas that constitutes the Hopewell world. What united them was not political identity, but participation in a shared symbolic and ceremonial system. And this flexibility, this ability to adapt to local conditions while preserving a shared core, is what made the Hopewell Interaction Sphere so remarkably durable. In the Illinois River Valley, the Hopewell tradition took on a distinctly local flavour. The Havana Hopewell, as archaeologists call the Illinois expression of the culture, built their own earthwork complexes along the bluffs and floodplains of the Illinois River and its tributaries. Sites like the Ogden-Fetty complex and the Elizabeth Mounds show the same basic pattern of geometric enclosures and burial mounds found in Ohio, but with variations that reflect the specific landscape and resources of the Illinois region. The Illinois Hopewell relied more heavily on the abundant waterfowl and fish resources of the Illinois River Valley and their pottery styles, while sharing certain motifs with their Ohio counterparts, developed distinctive decorative patterns that set them apart. At the Napoleon Hollow site, archaeologists have found evidence of one of the most complete pictures of Hopewell domestic life available anywhere, including storage pits filled with the remains of processed nuts, charred seeds of domesticated plants, and the bones of dozens of animal species that together paint a vivid picture of a diverse and well-managed food supply. In the lower Mississippi Valley, the Marksville culture of Louisiana represents another regional expression of the Hopewell tradition. The Marksville site itself, located along the old river in Avoyelles Parish, contains a roughly circular earthwork enclosure surrounding several burial mounds, a layout reminiscent of Ohio Hopewell sites, but adapted to the flat alluvial landscape of the lower Mississippi. The pottery at Marksville is extraordinary, featuring elaborate designs that include raptors, serpents, and human hand and eye motifs that are unmistakably Hopewell in origin, but rendered in a style that is uniquely southern. The connection between Marksville and the Ohio Hopewell is one of the most intriguing puzzles of the interaction sphere, because the distance between them is enormous, more than 700 miles as the crow flies, and yet the stylistic and symbolic connections are unmistakable. In the Tennessee and Cumberland River valleys, the Copena culture represents yet another regional variant. The name Copena comes from copper and galena, the two exotic materials most commonly found in Copena burials, and the culture is concentrated in northern Alabama and southern Tennessee. Copena burial mounds contain some of the finest copper ornaments found anywhere in the Hopewell sphere, including large repoussé plates, ear spools, and ceremonial axes made from native copper. The Copena people also made extensive use of greenstone, a tough metamorphic rock that they shaped into polished celts and ceremonial objects of great beauty. Their connections to the Ohio heartland are evident in the exotic materials they received and in the burial practices they shared, but their local adaptation to the limestone caves and rich forests of the Tennessee Valley gave their culture a distinctive character. In the upper Great Lakes region, communities participated in the Hopewell network primarily as suppliers of copper and as recipients of goods flowing back from the Ohio heartland. The copper mining operations on the Keweenaw Peninsula and Isle Royale in Lake Superior had been active for thousands of years before the Hopewell period, and the people who controlled access to these copper sources occupied a position of considerable importance within the exchange network. They were the gatekeepers of one of the most valued materials in the entire Hopewell world, and the relationships they maintained with communities hundreds of miles to the south were among the most enduring and consequential of all the connections within the interaction sphere. In the Appalachian region, communities in what is now North Carolina, Virginia, and West Virginia served as the primary sources for mica, the glittering mineral that the Hopewell artisans transformed into some of their most ethereal creations. The mica deposits of the Blue Ridge Mountains, particularly those in the Spruce Pine district of western North Carolina, produced sheets of extraordinary size and quality, some of them large enough to cut into the life-sized hand silhouettes that are among the most iconic Hopewell artifacts. The people who quarried and prepared this mica were integral participants in the interaction sphere, linked to the Ohio heartland by relationships of exchange and shared symbolism that spanned hundreds of miles of mountain terrain. Each of these regional expressions of the Hopewell tradition was unique, shaped by local environments, local resources, local histories, and local creativity. And yet they were all connected, all part of a single vast network of exchange and shared meaning that stretched across the eastern half of North America, like a web spun from threads of copper and mica, and obsidian and shell. A system that was flexible enough to accommodate local variation, while maintaining a core set of ideas and practices that were recognizable from one end of the network to the other. And then, around 400 to 500 AD, the Hopewell Interaction Sphere began to dissolve. The great earthwork construction projects slowed and eventually stopped. The long-distance exchange networks contracted. The elaborate burial practices became less common. The exotic materials that had once flowed into the Ohio heartland in such abundance became scarcer and eventually ceased arriving altogether. What happened? Why did this extraordinary network, which had endured for more than half a millennium, finally come apart? This is one of the great unanswered questions of North American archaeology. There is no evidence of conquest or invasion. There is no evidence of a sudden catastrophic event, no volcanic eruption or epidemic or environmental disaster that could explain the decline. The period between about 400 and 600 AD saw a shift in climate patterns across the Northern Hemisphere, sometimes referred to as the Late Antique Little Ice Age, that brought cooler temperatures and more unpredictable weather to many parts of the world. In eastern North America, this cooling may have shortened growing seasons, reduced the productivity of the managed forests and garden plots that Hopewell communities depended on, and made it harder to produce the surplus food necessary to support large ceremonial gatherings and long-distance trade expeditions. When food becomes scarce, communities tend to turn inward, focusing on local survival rather than maintaining distant relationships. The luxury of sending a delegation on a months-long journey to obtain copper from Lake Superior or obsidian from Yellowstone becomes harder to justify when your own community is struggling to feed itself. And as the journeys become less frequent, the relationships they sustained begin to atrophy. The people at the other end of the route stop expecting your arrival. The protocols of exchange that had been maintained for generations begin to be forgotten. The web of connections that had held the entire network together begins to fray, one thread at a time, until what was once a continent-spanning tapestry becomes a collection of disconnected fragments. Imagine standing at one of the great earthwork complexes, perhaps Newark, perhaps Chillicothe, sometime around 450 AD. The earthworks are still intact, their walls still standing, their geometric precision still evident. But something has changed. The last major ceremonial gathering was years ago, perhaps a decade or more. The paths that once connected the earthworks to distant communities are growing over, the parallel walls obscured by young trees and tangled undergrowth. A few families still live in the vicinity of the earthworks, still use the Great Circle for small-scale ceremonies, still tell stories about the great gatherings that used to take place here. But the stories are becoming more distant, more legendary, more like myths and less like memories. The grandparents remember attending the great ceremonies in their youth, but the children have never seen anything like it, and they listen to the old stories with the polite but slightly skeptical attention that children everywhere give to tales of a world they cannot quite imagine. The exotic materials have stopped arriving. The last piece of Yellowstone obsidian to reach this valley came years ago, and it was smaller than the pieces the grandparents remember, less finely worked, as though the artisans who shaped it were in a hurry or had lost some of the old skill. The copper supply has dwindled too, and the community's remaining copper ornaments are being carefully conserved, brought out only for the most important occasions, treated with the reverence due to objects that can no longer be replaced. The Hopewell Interaction Sphere is not dying with a bang. It is fading slowly and quietly, like embers cooling in a fire that no one has tended for too long. The light is still there, still warm, still beautiful. But it is diminishing, and everyone can feel it, even if no one quite knows how to stop it. Some archaeologists have suggested that changes in climate, particularly a cooling period that may have affected agricultural productivity, played a role. Others have pointed to the possibility that the social systems supporting the exchange networks became unsustainable, that the demands of maintaining such far-flung connections eventually outweighed the benefits. Still others have suggested that the Hopewell did not really disappear at all, that their traditions were simply transformed into new forms that archaeologists recognize by different names. The transition from the Hopewell period to what archaeologists call the late woodland period was not sudden or dramatic. It was gradual, like a tide slowly receding, leaving behind traces of what had been there before but no longer reaching the same heights. The earthworks were not abandoned overnight. Communities continued to use them for ceremonies and gatherings, but the scale and ambition of the construction projects diminished. The long-distance exchange networks did not snap shut like a closing door. They contracted gradually, the range of exotic materials shrinking, the quantities declining, until eventually the great flows of obsidian and copper and mica and shell that had sustained the Hopewell system for centuries dwindled to a trickle and then ceased altogether. Some archaeologists have pointed to the adoption of the bow and arrow, which reached eastern North America sometime around 500 AD, as a factor in the Hopewell decline. The bow and arrow is a more democratic weapon than the atlatl spear that preceded it. It requires less upper body strength, less training, less physical conditioning to use effectively. Its adoption may have undermined the social hierarchies that supported the Hopewell ceremonial system, making it harder for elites to control access to the prestige goods and exotic materials that were the currency of the Hopewell world. Others have suggested that the spread of maize agriculture, which was gradually adopted across eastern North America during this period, fundamentally altered the social and economic landscape. Communities that could grow their own food were less dependent on the exchange networks that had sustained the Hopewell system. They could feed themselves without maintaining the far-flung connections that had been necessary when ceremonial life depended on materials from distant sources. In a sense, the communities became more self-sufficient, more inward-looking, more focused on local concerns, and less invested in the continent-spanning web of relationships that had defined the Hopewell era. But what emerged from the decline of the Hopewell was not a dark age. It was a period of diversification and experimentation, as communities across eastern North America developed new ways of living, new forms of art, new ceremonial practices, and new relationships with the land. In the upper Midwest, in what is now Wisconsin, Iowa, and Minnesota, a remarkable culture emerged during the centuries following the Hopewell decline. Archaeologists call them the effigy mound builders, and their monuments are among the most visually striking in all of North America. Instead of the geometric earthworks favoured by the Hopewell, the effigy mound builders created mounds in the shapes of animals, birds, bears, deer, turtles, panthers and other creatures, laid out across the hilltops and bluffs overlooking the rivers and lakes of the upper Midwest. Some of these effigy mounds are enormous. A bird effigy at what is now Mendota State Hospital in Madison, Wisconsin, has a wingspan of over 600 feet. A group of marching bear effigies near Blue Mounds, Wisconsin, stretches for hundreds of yards along a ridgetop. The effigies are best seen from above, their animal forms becoming clear only from a high vantage point or, in modern times, from an airplane. From the ground, they appear as low ridges of earth, subtle rises in the landscape that could easily be mistaken for natural features. But from the air, they reveal themselves as what they are, the largest works of representational art ever created by human beings, images so enormous that they are measured not in inches or feet, but in hundreds of yards. The effigy mound builders were not Hopewell. They did not participate in the long-distance exchange networks or build geometric enclosures or produce the elaborate burial offerings that characterized the Hopewell tradition, but they inherited the Hopewell impulse to inscribe meaning into the landscape, to reshape the earth into forms that carried spiritual significance, to create monuments that would endure long after their builders had passed from living memory. In the southeast, another post-Hopewell development was taking shape. Communities in what is now Georgia, Alabama, and Florida were developing increasingly complex social organizations, building larger and more permanent settlements, and experimenting with new forms of mound construction that would eventually culminate in the great temple mound tradition of the Mississippian period. The Swift Creek and Weeden Island cultures of the southeast produced pottery of extraordinary beauty and complexity, with stamped and incised designs that encoded symbolic information in much the same way that Hopewell copper plates and mica cutouts had done. The designs featured birds, serpents, human faces, and abstract geometric patterns that demonstrated both artistic sophistication and deep engagement with the natural and supernatural worlds. And in the Ohio Valley itself, the heartland of the old Hopewell world, communities continued to live and thrive, even though the great earthwork construction projects had ended. They farmed their gardens of sunflowers and squash and chenopodium. They hunted deer in the managed forests. They gathered nuts and fished the rivers and streams. They buried their dead, though with less elaborate ceremony than their Hopewell ancestors had employed. And they remembered. They told stories about the old earthworks, about the people who had built them, about the ceremonies that had once filled them with light and song. The earthworks themselves, even those that were no longer actively maintained, remained important landmarks in the landscape, places of power and memory that continued to shape the spiritual geography of the region for centuries after the last Hopewell artisan had laid down their tools. And in fact, the mound-building tradition did continue after the Hopewell. It did not end. It evolved. In the centuries following the decline of the Hopewell Interaction Sphere, new cultures emerged across eastern North America that carried forward elements of the Hopewell tradition while developing their own distinctive practices and architectural forms. The most spectacular of these successor cultures would eventually produce the largest earthen structure in all of North America, a flat-topped pyramid of earth known as Monk's Mound, at a place called Cahokia, just across the river from what is now St. Louis, Missouri. But let me give you just a taste of what was coming, because the thread that connects Watson Break to Poverty Point to the Adena to the Hopewell does not end with the Hopewell. It continues, unbroken, all the way to Cahokia, the greatest city in North America before the arrival of Europeans. Cahokia emerged around 1050 AD, roughly 500 years after the Hopewell decline, in the broad floodplain of the Mississippi River, near the confluence of the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers. At its peak, around 1100 AD, Cahokia was home to perhaps 20,000 people, making it larger than London at the same period in history. Its central feature, Monk's Mound, is a flat-topped earthen pyramid that rises 100 feet above the surrounding plain and covers about 14 acres at its base. It is the largest earthen structure in the Western Hemisphere. Around Monk's Mound, more than 100 other mounds of various sizes were arranged in a carefully planned pattern, aligned to the cardinal directions and to astronomical sightlines, enclosed within a massive wooden palisade that was rebuilt multiple times during the city's history. The Grand Plaza, an enormous open space at the foot of Monk's Mound was deliberately levelled and filled, requiring the movement of enormous quantities of earth to create a perfectly flat surface covering about 50 acres. Cahokia had its own version of Stonehenge, a circle of massive wooden posts that archaeologists call Woodhenge, aligned to the positions of the sunrise at the solstices and equinoxes. And Cahokia had trade networks that, like the Hopewell before it, drew materials from across the continent, copper from the Great Lakes, shell from the Gulf, chert from various quarries, and a host of other materials that fueled the city's economy and its ceremonial life. The parallels between Cahokia and the Hopewell are striking and not coincidental. Both were centred in the river valleys of the Midwest. Both constructed monumental earthworks aligned to astronomical events. Both maintained extensive trade networks that brought exotic materials from distant sources. Both developed complex ceremonial practices centered around the honoring of the dead and the celebration of cosmic cycles. The Mississippian tradition that Cahokia represented was not a direct continuation of the Hopewell in any simple sense. 500 years separated them, and much had changed in the intervening centuries. Agriculture, particularly the cultivation of maize, had transformed the economic base of Eastern North American societies. Political organization had become more hierarchical, with paramount chiefs wielding authority over multiple communities. Warfare had become more common and more organized, but the deep underlying impulse, the impulse to reshape the earth, to align human constructions with celestial events, to create sacred landscapes that embodied the relationship between the earthly and the cosmic. That impulse was the same impulse that had driven the builders of Watson Brake 5,000 years earlier. It was the same impulse that had raised the mounds at Poverty Point, that had shaped the Adena burial mounds, that had inspired the Hopewell to build their geometric masterpieces in the Ohio country. It was a continuous tradition, the longest continuous architectural tradition in the history of North America, stretching from 3500 BC at Watson Brake to the arrival of Europeans in the 16th century, a span of 5,000 years. 5,000 years of people reshaping the earth to express their understanding of the universe. 5,000 years of baskets of soil carried on human backs and deposited in precisely the right place. 5,000 years of geometry and astronomy encoded in earthen form. 5,000 years of the dead being returned to the earth with ceremony and reverence and love. No other architectural tradition anywhere in the world has lasted as long. The pyramids of Egypt were built over a span of about 1,500 years. The great cathedrals of Europe were built over about 500 years. The mound-building tradition of North America endured for 5,000 years, and it was sustained not by the power of pharaohs or kings or the institutional authority of a church, but by the freely shared beliefs and practices of thousands of independent communities spread across half a continent. That is an achievement that deserves to be spoken of with awe, but that is a story for another night. Before I let you drift deeper towards sleep, there is one more part of this story that I need to tell you, because it is a part that reveals as much about us, about modern people, as it does about the ancient Hopewell. When European Americans first began encountering the great earthworks of the Ohio Valley in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, they were astonished by what they found. The scale and precision of the earthworks seemed impossible to reconcile with their ideas about the indigenous peoples who still lived in the region. Surely, they thought, these magnificent structures could not have been built by the ancestors of the people they were in the process of dispossessing and displacing. Surely the earthworks must have been built by someone else, some lost civilization that had vanished before the Indians arrived. And so was born one of the most persistent and pernicious myths in American history, the myth of the mound builders. According to this myth, which was widely believed throughout the 19th century and still persists in various forms today, the earthworks of eastern North America were built by a mysterious lost race that had nothing to do with the indigenous peoples of the continent. The candidates proposed for this lost race were numerous and imaginative. Some claimed the mounds were built by the lost tribes of Israel. Others attributed them to Phoenician sailors, or Welsh princes, or Vikings, or refugees from Atlantis, or visitors from ancient Egypt or India or China. The specific identity of the supposed builders varied from one theorist to another, but the underlying message was always the same. Indigenous Americans were incapable of building these earthworks. They were too primitive, too unsophisticated, too uncivilized to have produced anything so impressive. The mound builder myth was not just an innocent misunderstanding. It served a very specific political purpose. If the earthworks had been built by a lost civilization that the Indians had supposedly destroyed or displaced, then the European-American conquest of indigenous lands could be framed not as an act of aggression, but as a kind of cosmic justice, a reclaiming of territory that the Indians themselves had stolen from an earlier and more deserving people. The myth provided a convenient moral justification for the dispossession of indigenous peoples that was occurring at precisely the same time that the myth was most popular. It took decades of careful archaeological work to definitively debunk the mound builder myth. The key figure in this effort was Cyrus Thomas, an entomologist turned archaeologist who was appointed by the Smithsonian Institution in 1881 to direct the Division of Mound Exploration within the Bureau of Ethnology. Over the next 12 years, Thomas and his team surveyed and excavated hundreds of mound sites across eastern North America, compiling an enormous body of evidence that led to one inescapable conclusion. The mounds were built by the ancestors of the indigenous peoples who still lived in the region. The artifacts found in the mounds were consistent with the material culture of known indigenous groups. The construction techniques were consistent with methods documented among indigenous peoples by early European observers. The skeletal remains found in the mounds were consistent with the physical characteristics of indigenous Americans. There was no lost race. There never had been. The earthworks were the product of indigenous American genius, full stop. Thomas published his findings in 1894 in a massive report that effectively ended the mound builder myth as a serious scholarly position, although it continued, and continues, to circulate in popular culture and on the fringes of pseudo-history. And this is why the Hopewell Interaction Sphere matters so much, not just as a chapter of ancient history, but as a corrective to centuries of misunderstanding and deliberate distortion. Every time someone says that North America had no great civilizations before Columbus, they are perpetuating the same lie that the mound builder myth was designed to support. Every time someone suggests that indigenous Americans were simple nomadic hunters with no culture and no history, they are ignoring the evidence of the earthworks, the evidence of the trade networks, the evidence of the astronomical knowledge, the evidence of the artistry, the evidence of a tradition of monumental construction that lasted 5,000 years and produced some of the most extraordinary landscapes ever created by human hands. And there are signs that this is finally beginning to change. In 2023, the Hopewell ceremonial earthworks were inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, placing them in the same category as the pyramids of Giza, the Great Wall of China, Machu Picchu, and Stonehenge. It was a recognition that was centuries overdue. The road to that recognition was long and sometimes painful. For decades, the Octagon Earthworks at Newark, one of the most astronomically significant ancient structures in the Western Hemisphere, was operated as a private country club golf course. The fairways were laid out between the earthen walls, and golfers drove their carts over ground that had been shaped by ancient astronomers tracking the moon. Public access was limited to a handful of days per year, and the earthworks, which belonged to all of humanity, were effectively privatized for the enjoyment of a few hundred club members. It took years of legal battles and public advocacy, led in significant part by indigenous communities and their allies, to reclaim the site for public access and preservation. The Ohio History Connection, which manages the site, has been working to transform the Newark Earthworks from a little-known local curiosity into the world-class heritage destination that it deserves to be. New interpretive facilities are being planned, research is ongoing, and for the first time in generations, the Octagon Earthworks are being treated with the reverence and the seriousness that their builders intended. But preservation is an ongoing challenge. Many Hopewell Earthworks have already been destroyed, ploughed flat by farmers, bulldozed for development, or simply eroded away by centuries of neglect. Of the original 4 square miles of the Newark Earthworks, only fragments remain, the Great Circle and the Octagon preserved, while the connecting walls and smaller features have been obliterated by the growth of the modern city. The Hopewell Mound Group itself, the site that gave the culture its name, was extensively damaged by 19th century excavations that, while producing spectacular artifacts, destroyed much of the stratigraphic context that modern archaeologists depend on to understand the sequence and meaning of activities at a site. The story of the Hopewell Earthworks is in many ways a story of loss as well as discovery. Every earthwork that has been destroyed is a page torn from a book that can never be rewritten. Every artifact removed from its context is a sentence taken out of a paragraph, still meaningful on its own but diminished by the loss of the surrounding text. and yet what remains is still extraordinary, still powerful, still capable of inspiring awe in anyone who takes the time to visit these sites and stand within the earthen walls and look up at the sky and imagine what it must have been like to be here 2,000 years ago, surrounded by thousands of people who had come from hundreds of miles away, united by a shared vision of how the earth and the sky and the living and the dead were all part of a single magnificent whole. The Hopewell deserved to be as famous as the Egyptians, as the Greeks, as the Romans, as any of the other ancient civilizations that every schoolchild learns about. The fact that they are not, the fact that most Americans have never heard of them, is not a reflection of the Hopewell's insignificance. It is a reflection of our own failure to pay attention, our own willingness to accept a version of history that flatters our assumptions and ignores inconvenient truths. For now, let your mind rest on the image of those geometric earthworks in the Ohio moonlight, the perfect circles and octagons glowing softly in the darkness, the long parallel walls stretching across the landscape like paths between worlds, the materials gathered from the farthest corners of the continent, each one carrying the weight of 1,000 relationships, 1,000 handshakes, 1,000 shared moments of meaning. The Hopewell did not rule America through force. They did not conquer territory or subjugate peoples or extract tribute from the unwilling. They ruled through beauty, through meaning, through the irresistible power of ideas that resonated so deeply with the human experience that people separated by thousands of miles willingly participated in a shared vision for more than 1,000 years. Consider for a moment how unusual this is in the history of human civilization. Almost every other large-scale cultural network in the ancient world was held together by some form of centralized power. The Roman Empire had its legions and its roads and its governors. The Chinese dynasties had their bureaucracies and their armies. The Egyptian pharaohs had their divine authority and their vast administrative apparatus. Even the trade networks of the Silk Road were facilitated by the political stability provided by empires along the route. But the Hopewell had none of these things. No central government, no standing army, no bureaucracy, no written laws, no taxation, no system of coerced labour, and yet they maintained a cultural network spanning half a continent for more than 700 years. 700 years of voluntary participation in a shared system of belief and exchange. 700 years without a single war of conquest, without a single province being subjugated, without a single community being forced to participate against its will. As far as we can tell from the archaeological record, every community that participated in the Hopewell Interaction Sphere did so because they wanted to, because the benefits, both spiritual and material, outweighed the costs, because being part of the network enriched their lives in ways that made the effort worthwhile. This is a model of large-scale human cooperation that our modern world has largely failed to achieve. We organise our societies around competition and coercion, and the accumulation of wealth and power by the few at the expense of the many. The Hopewell organised theirs around reciprocity and shared meaning, and the circulation of beautiful objects that gained value not by being hoarded, but by being given away. There is something deeply instructive in this, something that goes beyond mere historical interest, and touches on fundamental questions about how human beings can live together at scale without destroying each other and the world they inhabit. The Hopewell found an answer to that question. It was not a perfect answer, and it did not last forever. But for 700 years, across an area larger than many modern nations, it worked. And the fact that it worked at all should give us pause, should make us question the assumptions that govern our own civilization, should make us wonder whether the way we have organized our world is really the only way, or even the best way, that it could be done. These are not idle thoughts. These are not the musings of a romantic dreaming about a golden age that never existed. The Hopewell Interaction Sphere is real, the earthworks are real, the artifacts are real, the trade networks are documented, the astronomical alignments are verified, the artistic achievements are undeniable. This happened. Human beings actually did this. They built a civilization based on beauty and meaning rather than force and exploitation, and they maintained it for centuries. If they could do it, what might we be capable of, if we had the imagination and the patience and the willingness to try? And if that is not an empire, then perhaps we need a better word for what it was. Something that captures both its vastness and its gentleness, both its ambition and its generosity, both its precision and its mystery. Whatever we call it, The Hopewell Interaction Sphere represents one of the greatest achievements of the human spirit anywhere on Earth, and it happened right here, on this continent, in this land that so many people still think of as having no history before Columbus sailed. That thought, the sheer wrongness of it, is almost enough to make you smile as your eyes grow heavy and the earthworks of Ohio fade into the comfortable darkness behind your eyelids. If you're enjoying this journey through the forgotten history of this continent, take a moment to subscribe to this channel and leave a comment telling me which aspect of the Hopewell Interaction Sphere surprised you the most. Was it the astronomical alignments, the trade networks, the artistry? Every comment helps this channel grow and helps me keep bringing you these stories. Now let your breathing slow a little more. Let the tension in your shoulders dissolve. Let the weight of your body press comfortably into whatever surface is supporting you. We have travelled far tonight, and there is still so much more to discover on future nights. But for now, rest. Rest knowing that the earth beneath you holds stories that span thousands of years. Rest knowing that the people who came before us on this continent were brilliant and creative and deeply attuned to the world around them. Rest knowing that their legacy is still here, still waiting to be recognised and honoured and understood. The mounds are still there in Ohio. The circles and octagons and squares are still there, some of them preserved, others buried beneath the towns and farms and parking lots that have been built on top of them. But the earth remembers. The earth always remembers. And on quiet nights, if you listen carefully enough, you can almost hear it whispering, telling you about the people who shaped it with their hands, who filled it with their dead, who encoded the movements of the moon and the stars into its surface, who believed that the geometry of the earth and the geometry of the sky were reflections of the same eternal truth. Let your body grow heavier now. Feel the weight of your limbs pressing into the surface beneath you. Feel the gentle pull of gravity, the same gravity that held the earth in the Hopewell Mounds in place for 2,000 years, the same gravity that pulls the moon across the sky on its 18-and-a-half-year journey from one standstill to the next. You are connected to the same forces that the Hopewell astronomers tracked with such devotion. The same moon that rose over the Newark earthworks 20 centuries ago is rising somewhere tonight, its pale light falling on the same Ohio landscape, the same river valleys, the same ridgetops where the earthworks still stand. The world spins on, and the moon follows its ancient path, indifferent to the centuries that have passed, indifferent to the empires that have risen and fallen, indifferent to everything except the gravitational dance that has kept it circling the earth since long before any human being existed to watch it. And somewhere in that indifference, there is a strange kind of comfort. The universe does not care about our deadlines, our anxieties, our to-do lists, our worries about tomorrow. The universe simply is, vast and patient and enduring, and the best thing we can do right now is be like the universe. Simply exist, simply breathe, simply rest. Think of the Hopewell astronomers standing on their earthen platforms on clear nights 2,000 years ago, watching the moon rise and set, night after night, year after year. There was no urgency in their watching. There was only attention, only presence, only the quiet discipline of showing up night after night and paying attention to what the sky had to show them. That is all you need to do right now. Pay attention to your breathing. Pay attention to the heaviness of your body. Pay attention to the way the darkness behind your eyelids feels like a warm and comfortable space. A space where nothing is demanded of you, where nothing needs to be accomplished, where the only task is the simple task of letting go. The Hopewell understood something that our modern world has largely forgotten. They understood that the most important things in life cannot be rushed, that understanding the universe requires patience measured not in minutes or hours but in lifetimes, that building something truly meaningful requires the sustained effort of many generations, each one contributing its small part to a project too large for any single person to complete. Your rest tonight is part of that same patient process. Your body is repairing itself, renewing itself, restoring itself for whatever tomorrow will bring. Your mind is sorting through the experiences of the day, filing away what matters, releasing what does not, preparing the ground for new thoughts and new insights and new ways of seeing the world. Just as the Hopewell prepared the ground for their earthworks, clearing the surface, levelling the soil, laying the foundation for something that would endure, you are laying your own foundation right now, in the quiet darkness, in the gentle rhythm of your breathing, in the slow, sweet surrender of consciousness to sleep. The ancient earthworks of Ohio will still be there in the morning. The moon will still be tracing its patient path across the sky. The story of the Hopewell will still be waiting to be told and retold, each telling a little different, each listener carrying away a slightly different piece of the whole, just as each community within the interaction sphere carried its own unique expression of the shared tradition. Sleep well tonight. Let your dreams tonight be gentle ones. Let them be filled with images of earthen walls glowing in the moonlight, of copper ornaments catching the firelight, of the slow, patient curve of the great serpent winding across its hilltop, of the sound of copper panpipes echoing across a geometric enclosure on a clear winter night 2,000 years ago. Let the rhythm of your breathing match the rhythm of the ancient builders, the steady, patient cadence of basketful after basketful of earth, being carried and deposited, the mound growing taller with each load, the vision taking shape one handful at a time. There is no urgency, there is no deadline, there is only this moment and the next breath, and the comfortable weight of sleep settling over you like the earth settling over a Hopewell burial, gently, reverently, with infinite tenderness. The stars are wheeling overhead, the same stars that the Hopewell astronomers watched, the same constellations that have guided travellers on this continent for thousands of years. Orion is rising in the east, his belt of 3 bright stars tilted at the same angle tonight as it was on the night that the first obsidian blade was placed beside the honoured dead in a Scioto Valley mound. The North Star is fixed in its place, a single steady point of light around which the entire sky appears to revolve, patient and unchanging, a celestial counterpart to the central post of the Hopewell Woodhenge, around which the solar year revolved. Everything circles, everything returns. The moon completes its 18.5-year cycle and begins again. The seasons turn and repeat. The rivers rise and fall, flood and recede, following patterns as old as the landscape itself, and human beings are born and live and die and are returned to the earth, and new generations rise from that same earth to continue the work, to add their own basketful to the growing mound of human knowledge and human experience and human love. And when you wake, carry a small piece of this story with you into your day. Remember the Hopewell. Remember what they built. Remember what they knew. Remember that they watched the moon for decades and encoded its movements in earthen geometry. Remember that they traded obsidian and copper and mica across a continent without armies or empires, held together only by the power of shared belief and mutual respect. And remember that the history of this continent is not a blank page waiting for someone else to write on it. It is a story that has been unfolding for thousands upon thousands of years, and every chapter of it is extraordinary,